Hello, welcome to the Freethought Forum of Knoxville. We were sponsored by the Rationalists of East Tennessee and ASK. These are the atheists of
Atheist Society of Knoxville.
Not South Knoxville, that's the Society of Knoxville. Welcome, and I hope you'll call in and give us some your comments. We're going to raise the question of how did Christianity begin? What's the origin or the origins of early first century Christianity? Where did it come from? And we're going to plunge into this right away. And
mostly because we don't have a script.
We don't have a script, and sometimes you do better without a script. The main thing we want to ask is, did Christianity begin in the first century? And the question is, well, no. You could say Christianity has very deep roots, like any movement, like democracy. You can't just say, well, there it began, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And there are too many roots for a movement like this. And so many of them go centuries before the first century. And what we were going to try to do is trace out a few of those roots.
Yeah, you know, a lot of people seem to think that the communities and so on of the time were rather isolated, but there was, you know, well before that, there was world travel and trade and exchange of not only goods but ideas, and there were so many ideas that came from India and
yeah, and then you're right there on the Mediterranean Ocean.
Yeah,
and Israel is right there. Egypt is right here. There's Rome, there's Europe over here. It's all over.
Really a cosmopolitan
already, yeah. You had the Romans moving in, the Greeks. And the Greeks moved in first, and that's why, well, the Apostle Paul wrote his letters in Greek, because when the Greeks conquered, you speak Greek. And so that you have the Greek background, you have the Hebrew background, certainly. And then you have all these, it's like a river, and you have many, many streams flowing in.
Yeah.
One of which is the Hebrew tradition.
But with so many religious movements going on at the time, many of them did not survive, perhaps the majority. So it makes me wonder how the religions that we have today were able to survive and rise above the din of what that was going on then.
Yeah, you could. Some people would argue first century Christianity did not survive by the time it got conquered and later on by politicians and re-baptized into another religion, that you just have fragments of early Christianity. I mean, that's one version, that Christianity as it was in the first century did not survive completely 100%. As a matter of fact, you have in one of the epistles to Peter saying all the believers are priests. And you have in the epistle to the Hebrews, the lesson is you don't need priests anymore. There's only one priest, and he's the high priest. He's not only priest on earth, he's priest in heaven, and that's Jesus. And so that wipes out the whole priesthood. So in that sense, you don't need a special class. They're all priests. And that's what I'm contending. It was a revolution. It took time to develop it. It was a political and a religious and a moral revolution. It took place. And it kind of bubbled in the first century, but it was already in the making.
But then maybe it's kind of inescapable because when we get over into Europe, there's the tension between the population and the priests and religious groups and then the rulers. Where the religious groups and rulers, which supported each other on the backs of the people, and of course that.
Well, as a matter of fact, you could make there are many who argue that politics and religion were so entwined in those days that some believe, some good scholars believe, that those early Christians, very early in the first century, believed that there was a historical Jesus, and that, this is kind of a Mark 13 maybe, that this Jesus was going to make a revolution on earth and in effect conquer the Roman Empire. And what he got for it was crucifixion, yeah. Because the Romans understood that to be, and there were revolutions at that time carried out by Jews, that is, armed revolutions. They didn't work too well. And then the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, not too long after the historical Jesus is said to have lived and died and been resurrected. And so those political revolutions were pretty commonplace. And some think Christianity was an attempt to have a revolution that was nonviolent. Others think, no, Jesus really thought he was going to bring in an armed, or really a dramatic confrontation. Now, we already got a good phone call. Let's hear what our caller has to say. Go ahead, please. Make yours good and loud.
This is Pauline. I wanted to say that it's my understanding that much of, let me mute here. Much of what we have in that early Christianity was parts of the pagan religion, the time that they selected for Christmas and for all the celebrations. Also, that many rulers or emperors were said to have been of virgin birth and were resurrected and performed miracles and did healings. Yeah. And besides the fact that Jesus was himself a Jew and his disciples were Jews, and it was all a part of the Jewish religion, and it was only after he didn't perform that the ability, or didn't conquer, as you just mentioned a few minutes ago, their enemies, that they decided that they would have to, somebody was wrong, and it couldn't have been them that he wasn't the Messiah. So they made the Jews wrong and started up the Christian side of it rather than continuing.
Yeah. Matter of fact, one theory, I'm glad you mentioned that, is that John the Baptist thought that he could bring in, or he was the kind of the Elijah bringing in a new kingdom. And Jesus was a disciple of John the Baptist, not the Southern Baptist, just John the Baptist.
Yes.
And that Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist, believing what he was teaching. And then he saw, this is one theory, what happened to John. He lost his head. And that's when Jesus started teaching the Sermon on the Mount, rather than bringing in this violent overthrow of the Roman government and turning your other cheek. In other words, you've got a different message. That's one theory, that Jesus saw this is not working.
Yeah.
What do you think, Pauline?
Yes, that's my understanding in my reading, and also I wanted you to address the point about the early Christianity was actually in order, like you said, politically, to not cause more problems. They took a bit of this religion and a bit of that religion and compiled a religion so that they could bring in people from different sects.
In fact, this was Jonas's. I think Jonas would agree with you. This is part of. This is moving, all different streams moving together. Yeah. Here. In fact, if you're like Paul, say, coming from a Hebrew tradition, he claims to be a Pharisee. Now but that's not the Sadducees. Sadducees were even more closely bound with the political powers, but the Pharisees were more religious than political. But still, they were political. And what Paul began to see is that if you're going to take this religion, this Jewish religion, out to the Gentile world, you've got to make some modifications. One of the better modifications is circumcision for males.
Yeah.
And I mean, imagine trying to convert a male Gentile, grown man, and baptism is a lot easier. And so Paul he circumvents circumcision with baptism, I guess you could say. And so your point is that here you have the Greek world, the Roman world, the Hebrew world, and they do business with each other. And so they have a common language in business. They have to interact. Then they have the food problem. If you're going to sit down with someone who's a Greek but not a Jew, but you're a Christian but you're a Jew, Paul raises the question: are you going to require them to eat the Jewish, diet? Or and so Paul begins to see, and of course he's from the Pharisee tradition. The Pharisees had already begun to make modifications. The New Testament sort of pits Jews versus Christians, but I think in reality, you have the Hebrews and the Jews many of them had already made all kinds of modifications, and Paul was part of this tradition.
Well, I guess looking at this idea of the modifications, there are perhaps two ways it could be done: by a central authority sitting out there and says, "Oh, well, we have to make this change, and we make this change," or it could be done by Christians who went to different communities in different parts of the world, and after living in those communities and trying to express things in ways that those communities would understand, then they start communicating with each other and bringing ideas back, and then someone has to resolve the differences and so on.
Go ahead.
So certainly, historically, there were all of these ideas, philosophical ideas that kind of converged and were converging at the time of the historical Jesus. And then there are the things that happened afterwards, that as the movement spread out and as they brought in new ideas. Now, if we jump to another thing, the expansion of Islam. There was a time when Islam was just spreading across the world, and there were lots of ideas that were included, and this was kind of the golden age where Islam really flourished. And then comes a time later when people say, hey, we have to get a handle on this. There are too many diverse ideas, and started crunching down to a...
Well, that's a really good point. In fact, you could see how Islam brought in a lot of Christianity, a lot of Judaism, and then their Arabic background. And you can see all these emerging, and then, of course, you can see the divisions developing, too. But we won't skip over to it. But we could do another program on that. It's very interesting to watch the same phenomenon happen. In the time of Plato, there's the story, it could be myth, but a story, that Plato was captured and taken to Egypt on a slave ship.
Oh.
And then there's where he learned a lot of his stuff, you see.
Oh. Sorry, Pauline. We seem to have lost you. I hope you.
See if we got her. No.
I hope you're
maybe
still listening.
Maybe she can call back.
Yeah.
Because she raised a whole. Yeah, Pauline, call back. We need you. So, her point, I think, is well taken. Is exceedingly well taken. Is that by the time you get the so-called pagan background of the Hellenistic religions and the Roman religions, and you get the Hebrews with their diversity among themselves, then it's sort of inevitable that Christianity become a kind of mixture of a number of these, and later on you can see they divided and go in all different directions too. But her point is, I think, right on the nose. It's a conversion and a moving together into this river in the first century. There's a phone call back. Go ahead.
Hey, how you doing?
Thank you. Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that Christianity is being political.
Can you speak louder? We can't hear you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Sure can.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned earlier about the early Christianity starting out very soon into a political type situation, and about how Paul altered it in order to maybe attract the Gentiles. And then you reminded me about how Constantine, when he was dealing with all these pragmatic pagans worshiping all these different gods, about how he brought his empire in under one religion. And it seems to me like he did it to have better control over the people in his empire. So it seems to me, from what you're saying, that using religion as a political tool is been repeated over and over up until this day.
And to this day, exactly.
As a matter of fact, Bill O'Reilly just now wrote a book called Killing Jesus. He goes into this tremendous, one part of it, he goes into a tremendous long detail about how Herod killed all the little babies. And Bill O'Reilly on national TV told everyone that the Holy Spirit directed him to write that book. And I'm just thinking, is it true? Is it possible that Fox and some political parties are using religion against the sincere and honest people who are believing it?
Well, sincerity is not the greatest of virtue, because I don't know, maybe Hitler was sincere, so I don't. But sure, politics has been using religion for centuries, and conversely, religion has been using politics for centuries, and that's why Thomas Jefferson and Madison tried to say, let's separate.
I'm going to let you go on with this, and I'm going to get off and get clear the line.
Okay.
We've got to ask you what your name was.
I can't tell you that.
We'll say Melchizedek.
I don't think the statute of limitations is finished yet.
Okay.
We'll talk to you later.
Okay, real good. Okay, but well, his point is this sort of thing continued for centuries, but we want to focus now on this first century and before.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking as the conversation was going on that P.T. Barnum was not the first person to recognize a way of dealing with people.
Okay, yeah. And,
you know what I'm referring to.
Okay,
where he says a sucker is born every moment.
Well, yeah, and what I want to do, though, is I want to get out of the habit of thinking if people don't accept my view, they must be idiots. That's, what I'm trying to say is these early Christians started like the way we do, and you and I have talked about this, so, I mean, I think we agree. People have to start where they are and try to solve problems with what they have at their disposal. And I'm contending these early Christians tried to solve problems that, one of which is they had this Roman Empire that from their point of view was pretty repressive. And let me read a passage here in early Luke. Well, I won't read all of it, but there's a passage in Luke in which, referring to the Prince of Peace and Savior and Lord, and this is referring to Jesus, but these were words in the Roman Empire that referred to Augustus Caesar. He was Lord, he was Savior, and Kurios Soter. He was Master, and there was even a legend that he walked among the people and some of them were healed. And this is Caesar. So what I'm thinking is the Gospel of Luke simply said we're tired of these politicians ruling us, and then they projected a ruler who actually said, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. contrary to the Caesars. I mean, you can see the very opposite. Blessed are the peacemakers, not those who come with a sword, but the real peacemakers who turn the other cheek. And I think this is in other words, what they were bringing was a social and moral revolution, projecting a new Lord. Now, you might say, well, this Lord didn't really exist, but they thought it did. And they projected onto this Messiah all the great values that many of us still admire, is the golden rule and peace-loving and concern for the down and out. And that was a revolution. And that's, my guess is that's why it spread so much. And then they had a revolution which these people, your point was well taken, is just the people got together with meals and more meals, and when they get together to talk over their dinners and their lunch and their suppers, and they call them the Lord's Supper, they're going to talk this revolution. And I think that's the way it spread.
Yeah, well, at the same time, if you're going to sit down and talk with someone, you have to, I mean, you can't be dogmatic about your own beliefs. You have to give and take and exchange ideas, and you know, that then provides a mechanism for reaching some kind of accommodation between different.
And you can see it operating. In fact, you have in Acts 2 a real conflict between Paul and Cephas, sometimes called Peter. Cephas just means head, and Peter means the rock. But there's a conflict because Peter or Cephas seemingly said the new converts have to go by the Jewish way of eating. And Paul says, no, people have to eat according to their own customs. Hey, we got another caller. Hey, go ahead. We got another caller. Come in.
Yes. I am presenting an idea by Faithless Forest. He wondered if you could describe for the viewers, excuse me, my phone was just still echoing there. He wondered if you could describe for the viewers the ideas of the Gnostics.
Okay, yeah. Gnostic is just a Greek word for gnosis, meaning knowledge. And the Gnostics, I mean, there's still a lot of debate as to what that means, but a kind of general notion is something like this. The Gnostics in the Greek world, or Greco-Roman world, or Pauline Hellenism is another book and deals quite a bit with this. But these Greek-speaking people around the Mediterranean there were believing they had spiritual insight and spiritual knowledge on how to live. And they had the knowledge, the gnosis, and that's where the word Gnostic came from. And then in this tradition was the notion that in dealing with sin and death and resurrection, they believed that there was a God or gods who died. See, they're dealing with the problem of suffering and evil. The gods come to earth and died and suffer. And then somehow that's why they're called mystery religions. Through some mystical way, they can identify with this God and gain the advantages of his death and resurrection. And so this author is one among many who claims that Paul developed his view partly out of that tradition. And so he took the Jewish Messiah and this notion of a dying Savior God and put the two of them together and believed that there was one of the Messiahs, or one of the Jews who came and actually died and was resurrected. And Paul says he's crucified with him. In other words, his death is in the death of this Messiah. And that's called a mystery religion. But you have another point. Go ahead and Pauline, you were making a point too. I wanted to hear. Go.
Okay, I wanted to make the point about the
early Christians were the ones who began to write down about Jesus and Jesus's life. And this was before the Bible as we knew it, as we know it, was compiled. And that in those days, that the average person wasn't educated, they didn't read, they didn't write.
Yeah.
So these people who would be writing the accounts, and of course it wasn't at the time of Jesus, the people who actually wrote the Bible as we have come to know it never even saw Jesus themselves. So it was an account that had been handed down to them, and that they were not professional scribes. There were professional scribes, and eventually professional scribes did write what the stories over. But something I didn't realize, never thought about, and I think perhaps the viewers would not have had an occasion to think about, was in those days there was no punctuation marks, there were no capitals, spaces, quotation marks, commas, anything. The words were just right on, and perhaps that had to do with the language it was originally written in. I don't know.
It's very likely the letters that Paul wrote, he didn't find very many commas in the paragraphs. It just flowed, and you had to have a lot. You had to have a lot of training. I mean, it's like language. You don't say, "Well, I'm talking now. Now there's a period." You just pick it up, and so in that sense, it's like hearing. But you're right. And then later on, they added the periods and the commas and the paragraphs, just as centuries later they put in, that's verse number 2, verse number 3, chapter 5. That came many years later. Yeah.
But I'm also thinking, just like with any foreign language, if people have taken foreign languages, they realize as you translate from one language to another, which certainly there were many translations. It's my understanding that Jesus spoke Aramaic, and then of course there was the Greek and the Latin and each language. And as these scribes copied down and translated, there may have been deadlines that they had to hurry up and get to because the emperor had decreed that it needed to be done by a certain time. There would have been errors of omission and adding words, or for clarification, they thought it didn't make sense.
Right.
Today we don't think certain things make sense.
Yeah, translation is partly interpretation, isn't it? I think.
Right. Yeah. And then I'm thinking, just in our lifetime, how when I was being raised, the King James Version was the be-all, end-all, and then it's now been modernized and made more user-friendly. And you hardly recognize it as being the same text because everybody's added their own interpretation.
Well, here's a good example is in the King James Version. Jesus says, "Take therefore no thought for tomorrow." Well, that's not what my mother taught me. Think about tomorrow. Look ahead. Plan. Well, the word thought then, and that's about 1611, let's say, the King James time. That's when Hamlet came out. That's King James English. And you can find in Shakespeare the word thought, but it doesn't mean just thought the way we think it. It's more like anxiety or worry.
Yeah.
And that's a big difference. And
just for us to understand, Chaucer, for instance, and that's all still English.
Yeah.
And here we're talking about several other languages, probably many other languages, and perhaps uneducated people being involved in this. Joe, I would also like for you and Jonas to speak about the was it the Nicene Council? Who was it that determined which
315?
which books would be allowed, and
on what basis did they decide that? And I'm going to get off and let somebody else get on.
Okay. Oh, that's a whole program on
okay.
which book, but it's very crucial. Which books were considered to be belonging to the Bible? I mean, they didn't just have there's a Bible. No, that developed over centuries. In fact, here's a book just came out called The First New Testament, Marcion's Scriptural Canon. He lived in 144 AD, or that's roughly when he lived. And he put together what some, or most scholars I think would say, he put down the first canon, which is mostly the writings of Paul. I need to put this up so see it better. So the first New Testament, in other words, he realized that there was a lot of controversy in those days as to what was Scripture and what was not. A lot of controversy. And so they were trying to put this together. And it's still the problem. For example, there's a beautiful story of the woman taken in adultery, in which these guys are about to stone this woman who's accused of adultery, and Jesus walks up and writes on the sand. Nobody knows what the writer is trying to say, but he probably was writing the women that these guys may have slept with. That'd be my guess. And they disappeared. And Jesus then said to her, "Woman, where are your accusers?" And she says, "I have none." And he says, "Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more." Now, this is a beautiful story. Now, that is in the King James, the Gospel of John. But in a modern translation, you'll see it might be in a footnote, because they know, the writers know, the translators know, that the better manuscripts don't have it in the Gospel of John. So where is it? It sounds more like Luke anyhow. Now, was that a real story of Jesus? Some say this story is more Jesus than, say, what you find in the Gospel of John. So Pauline's question is very, very pertinent. So what really is Scripture and what isn't?
Yeah, I have
oh, by the way,
a question I want to ask in a minute, but I think we're about at the midpoint where we need to talk about our sponsors and show a little video again. But again, this program is brought to you by the Rationalists of East Tennessee and the Atheist Society of Knoxville, and funded by them and other donors. And both of those groups would like to, either of them would like to invite people to attend their gatherings. The Rationalists of East Tennessee, that I'm more familiar with, meets on first and third Sundays at Pellissippi State Community College in the cafeteria annex. Start at 10:30, and there's coffee available afterwards, and usually some other things that add to the weight of
your calories.
And then there are other activities, a book club and the reflections, and then other seasonal activities like the solstice parties, and so it gives you an opportunity to
fellowship,
stretch and stretch your mind with others. Similar interests. And then the Atheist Society of Knoxville, I've only been to a few of those. You've been to more than I have, but it tends to be more of a group gathering, and people have discussions among themselves, as I understand
it's
it.
a mixture of intellectual talk and a social hour together, and it's kind of nice.
And they may meet weekly, and there will be a meeting that has probably started right now down at Barley's, and will continue. So if you would like to join the group, you're certainly welcome to do so.
Oh, good. I'm glad you mentioned this. I'd forgotten to do this. We didn't have our script for this.
Well, maybe we need to ask Sam if he would show some of the promotional videos that we show every week. Sam, when you're
To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org. If you
is that what
live
this
in or
means?
around the Knoxville area and are questioning your religious beliefs or simply believe in one less God than everyone else, well, you're not alone. The
when we were
Atheist
doing the
Society of
pirate show,
Knoxville
Lee
is
was
a
over
fun
there
and friendly
doing
group of people
hand
just
signals,
like
and I
you
had no
that meets
idea
twice
what
a
they were
week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun.
Okay, are we back?
Okay, wait.
Go ahead.
I know you want to get to Sophia.
Go.
But I was going to ask you this question. There were all these manuscripts that at the time the official Bible was compiled that came from all over and had been circulating and so on, and they were put together. Now people speak of the Bible as the Word of God. At that time, were they thinking of these writings as being divinely inspired?
Some did, and even that word, divinely inspired, that has various, the use of words, the way people use it, and they use this word differently, inspired. Literally, it means the Spirit put in, you see. And of course, in that world, they believe there are spirits floating around, spirits come in you and dictate stuff, sometimes just influence you. We still hear people saying, the Lord is leading me. And a Baptist will say, the Lord is leading me, but you'll rarely hear a Baptist say, the Lord told me. You have to go to the Assembly of God or the Church of God to do that. Those are differences, you see, among in fact, one Assembly of God preacher got tired of this, and he wrote a book called God Told Me to Tell You. But that was common in those days. People, they believed that demons and spirits, good and bad, and even people came to them in their dreams. Now, you and I say today, I dreamed someone came to me, but we know that's a dream. But in those days, many people believed when they had these dream experiences, these were real people coming to them in a different way. Yeah. And Paul says he went up to the third heaven. And then I wanted to mention earlier, when Paul and Cephas or Peter disagreed sharply, Paul says he rebuked him to his face. Now that's pretty strong language between two good Christian brethren. Later in the book of Acts, which is maybe decades later after the epistle to the Galatians was written, whoever wrote the book of Acts has Peter in the 10th chapter having a divine revelation from Jesus from heaven, telling him precisely what Paul had already been trying to tell him. And when I read that, I said, well, didn't Jesus supposedly tell Peter that in the first place? And I asked my New Testament teacher, one of them from seminary, who was 94 at the time, and I said, how come Peter didn't get the message in the first time? He said, well, Peter was a little stupid. Yeah, that was the way he put it.
Kind of reminiscent of some of the things that go on among the Mormons. Mm-hmm. But you were interested in this Sophia. Now tell me about Sophia.
Well, Sophia was a view that developed. So you can find this in the, I think it's Proverbs 22:8, I believe. I'd have to check it, but I think it's where it is. And then you had the wisdom of Solomon. They're in Alexandria, Egypt, where that big library was. I mean, that's a big intellectual center. That there was God had wisdom with him, and it's personified. And God creates through wisdom, you see. Now, and you can imagine how this happened in their thinking, is God is not going to create without wisdom. But they personified wisdom as if it were somehow a cohort with God. And then Paul the Apostle seemingly takes this character and identifies it with the Messiah you see, and calls Jesus the wisdom. Jesus Christ is the wisdom, the Sophia of God. And then he takes the characteristics of this Sophia who helped God create the world, and then he blends that with Jesus the Messiah and makes Jesus not only Messiah, but he's Lord, wisdom, and a co-creator. And then about 3 centuries later, you clearly have the notion that he's co-equal with God the Father, you see, with the notion of the Trinity. But you can see the stages in which this starts to develop. Now, some of the early Christians wouldn't make Jesus, the wisdom of God, co-equal with God. They would say he was the first of God's creation. But they were later called heretics. A heretic is somebody who didn't have enough political power to call the others heretics.
Yeah, the history is written by the victors.
The victors on that, yeah. So that's the wisdom, is the Sophia of God, is the cohort with God, creating and controlling the world. Now, what's interesting is in the Gospel of John, the 4th Gospel, it says, we call it John, nobody knows who wrote it. It starts, in arche ein ho logos. In the beginning was the Logos. Now, Logos is another word for Sophia. Now, a guy over in Alexandria translated Sophia apparently as Logos, and by the time you get to the 4th Gospel, you have, in the beginning was the wisdom, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You see, you can see how this process develops. And then the Word, the Logos, became flesh in the 14th chapter there, 1 John, and dwelt among us. And then he starts off with and then the 4th Gospel skips over Jesus' temptations and his birth, because he gets him running full speed right there in the 1st chapter. But that's a good example of borrowing heavily from Alexandria and other parts of the world, that Mediterranean area, and putting these different ideas together and coming up with their new system.
Yeah, I'm aware of the different religions of the East, and well, of course, there's Buddhism and the Hindus and Zoroastrians and all of that kind of stuff, and you can kind of see how that would work into influencing any religious movement. But is there anything that came from further west, or was that too primitive at that time?
Well, how far would you go at that time? Is over to Spain, maybe.
Yeah.
As far as you could get. I mean, you got the ocean, you got the Atlantic Ocean. So in the 1st century, they wouldn't have known anything.
Okay. Well, there was North Africa, I guess.
And North Africa was a major intellectual center, and then just across the Mediterranean, just north there, you got Athens, and you got Rome, and then you've got Israel over here. So you've got a kind of a triangle of real intellectual centers, and they, trade with each other. Business is a major influence in civilization, in my opinion, because if you're going to learn from other people, you've got to learn some of their language and some of their customs in order to do business with them, and to appreciate, how to get along with them. And we can see this operating. Now, Paul the Apostle traveled from town to town. And so he took all of his religion and he borrowed. And then this guy, Marcion, was either a ship owner or in the ship business. But he apparently did travel around, and he took his views with him. And later he was called a heretic. But he put together what may be the first Bible for the early Christians, the first scripture, and most of which is the Apostle Paul's works, because that's what impressed him, I think, the most. And of course, that travels better than to have Jewish customs or any local customs trying to impose them onto other cultures. That's hard to do. And Paul's religion is more transportable. because it's not so tied up with politics.
Yeah. Now you mentioned writing a book. When Pauline was talking, she talked about scribes and so on, and I would just bet that scribes were professional people who you told them what you wanted and they would write it down and not tell people what you were writing. But it was a way that anyone could get their ideas written down.
Now let's get on to the scribes, and we got a caller come in, but don't lose this track because that's an interesting trail of its own, the scribes. Okay, we got our caller. Go ahead. Are you with us?
Greetings.
Go.
Greetings, it's Jeffrey from Southern Ontario. How are you doing?
Oh, good. Ontario. Thank you.
How you doing?
Good. You mentioned earlier about Paul going around and adapting other pagan religions or local practices. That might be the first sign of Darwinian evolution in religion. That could kick the Christian right in the teeth. He adapted to local customs.
Well, the Christians I know would be, I mean, there are all kinds of Christians. I studied with Christians who were already Darwinists, so that would be common sense. It's called adaptability. And
But don't forget some of these early traditions. I think the earliest would be Zoroastrian, when more myths were suddenly become popular in the Western culture, Roman, Greek. The Hebrews caught on with that.
Well, you know,
if you adapt Mithras to ancient Hebrews, you end up with Christianity.
Well, you got a good point, a real good point with the Zoroastrian, which came a little bit later, but they were dealing with the same kind of problem. Why is there so much evil in the world? Now, by the time you get to the Christian period of the first century, you already had a concept of the devil that developed somewhere in that time. But the Zoroastrian view over there in Mesopotamia, what we call Mesopotamia, that was a view that God had two tendencies or two directions, goodness and also destruction. And that influenced, by the way, Augustine, who then developed this into a Satan character. But that's not what the Zoroastrians were doing. They were trying to say God had a problem with creation from the start. I remember a 10-year-old told me once, nobody's perfect, not even God. And that's what the Zoroastrians were trying to say, that things come and they've just got problems. Go ahead. Go ahead from Canada. Go.
Yeah. Does it come a little further east?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And the duality of God, that comes from Hindus.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Indo-Aryans were Persian, today's of Iran. And it got into the Middle East that way. But Mithras, even Julius Caesar was writing about his childhood. He mentioned that the devout Hebrews who lived in his mother's apartment building, so this would be dated about 90 BC, in order to avoid trouble with the local police, religious police, went around the corner and left offerings at the temple to Mithras. It was mother's apartment building. So you got the makings of Christianity, first century, right there at 90 BC. A good guess for you on this topic would be David Fitzgerald, because he wrote about mystic cults that exist in the first century BC and the first century AD. There were many of them.
Oh, yes.
If you combine them, which is what Paul did, you end up with the modern version, because Constantine had it organized. Yeah, he did it like a military form. Big use, ignore the other stuff, and we'll call it Christianity and make it the state religion. He didn't quite make it the state religion. He just said it was going to be legal. But his mother and a lot of other influential people were Christians by this time. I see. Well, your point's well taken. And in fact, this book right here, Paul and Hellenism, is basically trying to show how the mystery religions and many of these so-called pagan religions greatly influenced Paul. They had to, because they were trying to solve similar problems that he was trying to solve. And so the language is going to flow back and forth. And he spoke Greek. And he's going to understand what they're talking about from the inside.
And he also comes as a Hebrew, and so he's trying to say, well, how do these two cultures operate with each other? Because both those cultures, I think our caller is trying to say that these cultures get inside us, and then we have to put them together. If I'm understanding what you're saying, our caller, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
It sounds good. It's just an evolution of human thought and politics and religion combining. It's something we're stuck with. Yeah. But it's not that mystical. Paul was trying to promote something that he believed in, at the very least, and he was trying to make it adaptable to other people.
It's a good way to put it.
So he got rid of the circumcision. He allowed you can eat pork as long as you don't live near Jews. He let Gentiles in.
Yeah. And that was
without the Jewish rules.
And some of the early...
It evolved.
Yeah, to be fair to some of the early Jews, they were trying to do the same thing in their particular way. And Paul was saying you don't have to become a Jew or adapt to become a Jew in order to learn from the Jews, is another way of putting it. In that sense, it's back and forth adaptation. There's another thing is that he mentioned the Zoroastrians, which is skipping but a few centuries. But the important thing that I think being raised here is the Zoroastrians were trying to solve the problem of evil. And that's what some of these early Christians were trying to do. And what some of these pagans were trying to do is we've got a lot of suffering in the world, a lot of sorrow in the world, we've got death. If we've got a God in the world, how come? You see? How do you deal with it?
A Savior to avoid it.
Exactly.
Remember, the word Jesus Christ isn't even a name. It's actually a title. It means God's Savior anointed. It was never one person. These were mystical cults.
Put them together.
They never thought it was a person, neither did Paul.
Yeah,
they just applied a John Doe to it, which, of course, is Jesu Messiah or Jesu Christo. Well, what we call it Jesus Christ.
Yeah, Jesus is the Greek version for Joshua or Yeshua, and Christos it's the Greek word for Messiah. So it becomes later just a title. Actually, to borrow from what our author is, our caller is suggesting, is there were probably many Joshuas in Israel at that time. Many of them, and many of them had some wise sayings, and probably some of them had some political ambitions, and probably had some grandiose visions, and some of them got killed. Some of them got. In fact, there were 800 Jews, about a century or so. I'd have to check it, but a century or less earlier than Paul. 800 Jews, righteous Jews. Pharisees, I believe, I'll have to check, were crucified, executed. Now that had to make an enormous impact on the Jewish tradition. And one writer, G.A. Wells, suggests the possibility that G.A. Wells has done about 4 or 5 books on this problem, the historical Jesus. He suggests that maybe Paul believed that one of those executed Jews was the Messiah. But
that would likely be Simon of Pereira.
Well, that would be a possibility. Yeah.
And he was killed in battle, and his followers who survived were crucified.
But Paul did not believe that this Messiah that he's talking about was trying to start a political revolution. That's a big difference. He uses Isaiah 53 and what's called the suffering servant passages to identify his Messiah. That's the radicalness of Paul. He takes a suffering servant as a Messiah rather than a conquering king. In other words, how in the world are you going to pass off somebody crucified like a common criminal? Well, that's what he tries to do. He said, this is weakness becomes strength. In other words, that's the paradox. And I think what happened is early in that century, people who were down and out could identify with this a lot better than they could with saying, well, here comes Jesus riding in on a horse. And they'd say, where? But they can identify, well, Jesus is in among us when we're suffering. That's what I think happened. Go ahead. You had other things. Are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still with you. You were getting interesting, so I was listening to you. When you're running out of time, I think you got like 5 minutes left here.
Well, I do appreciate you calling.
It's always a pleasure to call into you guys. It's always very interesting conversations here.
And you're in Toronto, huh?
Right.
Yeah, I've been.
This is Jeff Rick from Toronto. You ever been to Toronto?
Yes, I have. Thanks to Paul Kurtz over there in New York. He took us over there. And that's a beautiful place, as a matter of fact. Beautiful. Thank you for calling in.
Yeah, I like it myself. Anyways, as always, it's a pleasure talking to you, and I'll turn you back over for your sign-offs.
And I hope we hear from you again. Thank you.
Keep up the non-fake.
Thank you. By the way, I want to emphasize another good book, Bart Ehrman, Misquoting Jesus. He deals a little bit with what we were talking about earlier, how these texts got put together. And then this is just a brand new book I mentioned. That's well worth reading. It's kind of complicated, but this is complicated business. And this book, I think many of our reviewers would really enjoy, is how these so-called mystery religions had a big influence on Paul. And here's another book I want to recommend. And these writers were saying, if you want to understand the Gospels, you might want to read the ancient Greek novels, because there's a lot of similarity, and some of it is just a little too coincidental. And they're contending that the Gospel writers borrowed heavily from some of the style and the stories in these Greek novels. And another book, if I can promote myself a little bit, called Linda Krager and I wrote In Search of Early First Century Christianity. I forgot my own title, in which we try to deal a little bit with some of these issues. Here's Paul and the Two Jews of Alexandria, for example, is just one title.
Well, how many books have you written, Joe?
Don't ask how many. It's more important to ask how many I've published.
Okay.
All you wrote, you don't get published.
I understand that.
I think about 10. I can't, something like that. I'm hoping to publish a novel, but keep hoping.
Oh, yeah, well, I think you need to thin that down. Last time I saw you had 800 pages. And
maybe I'll make it a series. But anyhow, I want to thank, and Pauline, we want to thank for calling in. In fact, I want to get her on this program sometime with us, because she's got a head full of stuff she's been studying and reading and thinking about this for a long time, and make a good contribution. We had her on once, remember. I want to get her back. So we've got a phone call coming in.
Quick.
Go ahead. We got a call. Quick. Go ahead. Let's hear from you.
1 minute.
I see you very often on this television show, and I just want to know about the atheism that you all believe in, and the fact that I never see any of you fellows there that are married, and it doesn't seem like you all have relationships or people that. Okay. There's one out of about 5 that I see.
Well, you didn't see my wife when she was on the program, did you?
I did.
Well, why don't you congratulate?
You guys look really unhappy.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
Sad, and I pray for you. I really do, guys. And it's like every guy that's on there with atheism. It's sad to see you all really unhappy.
Hey, look, we got.
Sorry that you are, and it's always that you are.
Well,
we got to go. We got to cut you off because we've just got 13 seconds.
People who pray for you too much will pray on you.
Please come back and view our show. Write in to us. Get on the internet and
call us again.